Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is March 18th, 2026. And it's good to be back. Guys, I want to give a shout out and thanks to Urban, my buddy Josh, for filling in for me while I was gone. I believe he did a great job. In fact, I had a wonderful conversation with Urban this morning as we were talking about maybe doing a future show together. Yeah, a future show. Maybe a show once a week between Urban and I. He was telling me stuff that was blowing my mind. And, you know, he has his own show, Urban Odyssey. You should go check it out. Just go to Google and type in Urban Odyssey, and you'll also see him on Substack. And he also has helped me a lot throughout my show as a producer. And we just love Josh. And Josh has been doing a great job. And we want to give a shout out and thanks to him. I really appreciate everything that you've done while I've been gone. And I want to let you guys know that tomorrow night at 9 p.m., like I do on my normal show, we're going to have a special show between me. It's going to be live. It's going to be me and Josh. And we are going to but uncover the sources of all of the dynasties that we have uncovered. All of the information that I've been able to collect, he's been able to collect, and he's done a lot more than just I. So he's done some more legroom and work, and he's gone a little bit deeper than I have. And so we're gonna expose all the dynasties, the Black nobility, the Illuminated, and including the Orsini, and where we got all of this information from. Tomorrow, we're going to expose it, the actual sources. We're talking Santos Bonacci, we're talking Israel Zeus, and we're talking Fritz Springmeier, and we're going to be talking about them tomorrow night live on the show. And I believe we're going to make it so that you guys can come on as a guest. So it's going to be a special tomorrow night at 9 p.m., my normal time. And we're going to have, it's just going to be live between I and Urban. And we're just going to go back and forth and talk about everything that we've learned. And I am honestly excited about this because usually my shows are just, you know, what I've written and what we go through. And then after that, it's like, it's over. I'm like, oh, I can rest. But here between Josh and I, man, we'll be bouncing things back and forth. And I think it's going to be very entertaining and also very educational. So I'm looking forward to that. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the story behind the story, how the secret society narrative was built. I received a bunch of information back and forth between Sally of the South. I'm sure you guys have seen Sally posting a lot on my Rumble. And Sally said, look, if you really want to dig deep into these secret societies and the history of all of it, you need to download these books. And she sent me about 120 books. And while I was on vacation, I downloaded 98.1% of all of those books, meaning I got almost all of them. There was just a few I just couldn't find. Nowhere to be found. So, but I got almost all of them, and it took me a long time. And then I basically uploaded them into AI, and she said, let's see what your AI can come up with. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about that. And we're going to be talking about examining one of the most persistent narratives in modern history. A narrative. Go figure. The belief that hidden societies operate behind the scenes to guide revolutions, shape nations, and steer the world toward a predetermined outcome. And rather than beginning with assumptions, this investigation tonight follows the narrative itself back to its origin, tracing how secret societies, Freemasons, Luciferians, Satanists, Knights Templar, all of these things. And we're going to trace it back to its origin and how it emerged in the aftermath of the French Revolution. In fact, that's where all this stuff really popped out, and how it was carried forward through the writings of religious critics, political theorists, philosophers, and ideological movements over the next 2 centuries. Not decades, but centuries. And each generation inherited actual fragments of the same explanation, but they reshaped it according to its own fears, conflicts, and worldview. And they passed it forward as if it were confirmed truth. Now, by examining these works together instead of in isolation, a different picture begins to form. What appears at first to be independent confirmation across time reveals itself as a chain of influence. Authors building on earlier interpretations, repeating key claims, and expanding the scope of the narrative without introducing new primary evidence. Guys, I'm all about the evidence now. I'm not about just saying, oh, there's a bunch of Luciferians living underneath us doing their chants. I got to get evidence. And the result is a story that gains power through repetition, not through documentation. And believe me, if there was, I want to prove it. I want to show it to you. And just like every time when I dig through this information, I've read a lot through this stuff too as well. I was bored, didn't have much to do. So I was just reading. And I'm telling you, we need documented evidence. But at the same time, we're not going to dismiss the existence of real power structures, private networks, or elite influence. No, they could be hiding and covering their tracks by, I don't know, deleting the books off the internet. Is it possible? Well, all you have to do is just find who's hosting the information and then do whatever you got to do. It is possible. But I'm talking about stuff that we can find that we can draw conclusions to, not just theorize. And I know you go, oh, let's give the Satanists one step ahead of us. No. Truth shall make us free. Now, they may hide shit, but that's on them. Eventually, enough of the truth comes out where people get suspicious enough and do their own homework. Maybe they can take from what I worked on and build on the narrative and maybe find some information. So we're not going to dismiss that these baby eaters are all doing human trafficking underneath islands and riding in submarines and eating babies. We just don't know. But we're going to draw a clear line between what can be historically supported. Economic power, for example, political alliances, ideological movements, and what has been layered onto these realities through speculation, fear, and inherited belief. Now, the goal is not to silence concern, but to sharpen discernment here, allowing you guys to distinguish between documented history and narrative tradition. And in doing so, this episode should reframe the question entirely. The issue is no longer whether hidden forces exist, but whether the story that we have received accurately explains them. By returning to the original texts and following the development of the narrative step by step, we should reveal not a single unified conspiracy, but a centuries-long attempt by different voices to make sense of a rapidly changing world. And the result is a deeper understanding, not just of the claims themselves, but of how those claims came to exist, why they persist, and why they continue to resonate today. Shout out to everybody on the live chat Rumble. Number one warrior is Scorpion. Scorpion saying, hey, Pastor and Warrior family, I hope you enjoyed your time off. Missed you. Urban was great. Thank you. I did. My voice is a little rash. I actually did a deliverance earlier. Sometimes when you do a deliverance, you're screaming at demons. So my voice is a little off. And also springtime. And it's like, it got so warm today. So I'm like, flammage coming out. But hey, it is what it is. Number two warriors, my man Boots Hafner. Boots stating, hey, all right. Welcome back, James. Voice of the Rumble airwaves and creator of the award-winning detoxifier potion, elitepotion.com. Hello, warrior family. Glad to see you in here. And let's all hit that thumbs up button. Yeah, if there's really 11 of you, I should be able to get 11 likes. If there's 12 of you, well, do me a favor. Take your thumb, follow mine, go down to your phone and hit that X button, then hit thumbs up, then hit live chat. It shouldn't be that big of a deal. And if you're watching this not live, please hit the thumbs up anyway. It'll help me. Rumble doesn't judge me based on how many people view it. They judge me how many people actually like it. Now, I don't like to manipulate it, but this is the truth. And I know how lazy we can be. It's like, yeah, well, I'll just let James do everything. And, well, this is needed, okay? All right, let's get into shitty, crappy, horrible. And I forgot to play the news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News.
That worked. All right, Robert Goodison says, hey, Captain James, scream this demons away. I love you guys. I know I don't show it very often, but I do. Live updates on Trump threatens to massively blow up Iranian gas field if Iran doesn't, do what they say. Well, who gives a shit? I mean, blow it up. I don't care. It's not like things aren't expensive anyway. It's not like all the prices finally went down to where everyone can survive. It doesn't matter. They're playing with you. They're playing with you. Mark Wayne Mullen's confirmation hearing was the funniest in ages and might have some stunning outcome. I never even heard of this guy. I don't really care. Apparently, Senator Mark Mullen's nomination for Homeland Security Secretary is not a particularly controversial one. As Trump appointments go, he spent a dozen years in the House and Senate. He gets along well with Republicans and Democrats. And everyone will be glad to see Secretary Christie Noam go. Well, that's according to Slate magazine. Maybe there are a few people who don't care, but that's just your opinion. Gabbard tells senators Iranian regime is degraded but still intact. Well, that must have been a bitch. Well, it's degraded, but they're working. They're still doing their shit. Well, it's not me. If it was my choice, I'd pull all of our military out of everything. And then I would build greater walls and keep our country safe from Canada, safe from Mexico, safe from Cuba, safe from the European banks who have, profited off of the printing of US dollars for decades. But that's just me. Not that it would happen, but that would be the best thing for any country to do. Stop trying to build a new world order. It never works. God doesn't allow it. So just stop it. Stop it. Dolores Huerta, sexual violence survivor, speaks out against Cesar Chavez. Okay. Now, I'm not saying sexual violence is a good thing. No, it's horrible. And yes, Cesar Chavez, okay. Bad guy. Well, any leader in any position eventually gets corrupted. As absolute power corrupts, absolutely. So what are we all... What are we doing here? Dolores, I'm sorry that happened. And I hope you get the bastard. FBI investigates Joe Kent, whose resignation over Iran war angered Trump. So Joe Kent resigned, and Trump's angry because apparently he did something Trump didn't like. So he resigned, and now they're investigating him with the FBI. Yeah. Typical Trump. Typical Biden. They all do it. Dude, have we forgot that the Biden administration used the Department of Justice and the FBI against its own people? Let's not be stupid here. It made headlines. And it was like, yeah, that's Biden. That's different. Blue's good. Red bad. They're the same people. They all should wear logos like race car drivers. They're liars. And they're sponsored by corporations, and they will do what corporations say. Or they will get blackmailed, especially by Israel. God help you. When Israel calls, when you become a senator or a congressman, when Israel calls and says, oh, we'd like to bring you to Israel for a 3-day paid vacation. We want to show you God's country. Oh, and how great we are. Yeah. Well, they drug you and videotape you with some lewd shit. I wouldn't go there. Pentagon seeks more than $200 billion in budget requests for Iran war. You already get $1 trillion a year. You want $200 billion more. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? When was the last time when the Pentagon said, we're going to need some more money for this war? Never stops. Should the war be over by now? Absolutely, if they bomb the right places. It seems they are not doing such a good job at that. Hey, I'm not the Pentagon. I'm sorry, the Department of War, whose name should tell you all. They are the bad guys. We went from, we're the Pentagon, now Department of War. That should speak volumes for you people. We are a warring country. That's how we make money. It's the only way the economy will survive. Because, well, AI bubble is ready to pop, and they need something to replace that one. We need another war. Makes sense to me. Let's go gobble up some more countries. I don't know why we haven't taken Cuba back. I mean, why don't we own Cuba? All right, when we come back, we're going to be talking about the story, behind the story, how the secret society narrative was actually built. Stick around.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
Paying federal income tax is voluntary. So why has every person you know done it their entire lives? You were told it's the law, but the system was built on a lie hidden in plain sight, that you are required by law to pay. The truth is, 98% of Americans don't owe income tax by law. Federal income tax is for federal employees. For everyone else, it's voluntary. You agreed to pay when you signed your first tax return, and you've been renewing that contract every year since. Sounds too good to be true? You're asking, why doesn't everyone know this? Because almost everyone signed before they were old enough to understand it. It's time to unlearn the lie and break free from IRS jurisdictions, protect your assets, and keep more of what you earn legally. Visit unincorporatedisassociations.com now and become tax-free.
Well, they print it anyway. That's what they do. You know what? U.S. dollar's not backed by anything. So they could just print and shove it out there. They say, we pull it. What do they call that? Oh, I forgot the name. Quantitative easing. I don't care. It's all a scam. It's a Ponzi scheme. I agree. America, the Federal Reserve, yeah, they really care about the people. If they did, well, shouldn't we own their reserves? Shouldn't we? No. That's not how private central bank works. Assholes. Doughboy's here saying, welcome back, James. Good to see you. Hey, thank you. You too. Robert Gertison says, seems like Europe is deteriorating faster because of the lack of borders. Well, yeah. Absolutely 100%. No borders means, hey, all of your traditions and values and culture goes bye-bye. Because, hey, you're bringing in new sources of culture. And they're going to bring in their culture. And then all of a sudden, hey, we're all united. We're all one. Whatever. Doughboy says, welcome back. And Boot says, they can borrow the money from NASA. Yeah, the $200 billion that Pentagon wants. We need $200 billion. We got to buy some more bombs. We used them all. We bombed Iran. We used them all. We need more bombs. Well, how much is it going to cost? $200 billion. Fuck. That's how it is. It's not me. I'm not the one doing it. I'm just reporting what these yahoos are doing. They're just taking a little off the top, aren't they? And it's going to their buddies. Well, the dudes that make the bombs are friends with all the dicks that are in the Pentagon, aren't they? Well, I can't prove it. But it wouldn't surprise me. But again, that's the whole point. It's not what you think you know, it's what you can prove. And even though it's obvious right in front of our faces, in order for me to be a good Christian, I can't report on something that's a lie. That's not being a good citizen and not being a good Christian, especially if I'm representing the kingdom of heaven. And when I went through these 120 books to expose the secret society narrative and to find that, they do. They're all plotting to bring Satan up with his Antichrist. Well, most of those books were about speculation. Most of those books were opinion. Most of those books were written through emotion. None of them carried weight of evidence. And there is a story behind the story here, folks. Not the one that people argue about, but the one that built the argument itself. And for over 2 centuries, a narrative has moved, secret societies, even though they exist, but that they are the ones controlling the world. That's moved through history, quietly at first in the 1700s, and then louder with each generation. And it claims that behind revolutions, behind financial systems, behind the rise and fall of nations, there is something hidden, something organized, something operating just out of view while the world reacts to what unfolds right in front of it. Well, if there's evidence, then the truth should, or then examining these books should not be that big of a deal, because if the evidence is there, the truth isn't afraid. But what is afraid? What's afraid is the lie. If there's no evidence to back it up, then that's what's afraid. Now, I'm not saying there are not secret societies. They are there. The Freemasons openly say they're a secret society. But to say that one group of secret societies control the entire world, well, that's something different. Now, most people encounter that claim in fragments. A quote here, a reference there, a name repeated often enough that it begins to feel established. Feel. Dude, that's the problem with us, is if it feels good, we run with it. Well, that's how I was 3 years ago, and I refused to do it. And maybe that's why I continue to lose subscribers, I guess you call them subscribers, just viewers, is because I refuse to continue with the narrative that sounds right and feels right. Look, I'm putting my name out here. This is my name. I'm not under some pseudonym name. This is Cause Before Symptom with James Carner. And if I'm going to put my name out there, I'm going to find evidence and tell you the truth on what I find. And believe me, when I went through these books, I was excited. I'm like, finally, we can now show you evidence that the secret societies have been plotting together against us for a new world order and bring in their Antichrist. And what I've been finding are quotes and references and names that were repeated. But very few stopped and asked a different question. Where did this story come from? So instead of repeating it, the work began by going back, not to commentary or summaries, but to the texts themselves. Dozens of them, spanning centuries, written in multiple languages, some very clear, some very damaged, because I had books from the 1700s. It took me hours to transcribe. Some requiring reconstruction just to read a single page. And this was not a surface read. This was line by line, author by author work, not looking for confirmation, but looking for origin, continuity, and proof. And I was dead set on knowing that this was going to prove it. All, once and for all. Well, the trail leads back to the aftermath of the French Revolution, when Europe was trying to understand how an entire order collapsed so quickly. Writers like Abby Augustin Barruel argued that such a transformation could not have happened without hidden coordination, pointing towards secret societies and ideological networks operating beneath visible power. Well, she didn't prove it. It was just, to her, it's obvious. And around the same time, John Robison reached similar conclusions, suggesting that groups like Freemasonry carried influence across borders. But when their arguments are examined very closely, something becomes clear. Their reasoning is built on interpretation, on the speed of events, on perceived alignment, not on documented chains of command or verifiable operational structures. Now, I'm not saying that they're not there. I'm saying that in order for us to find this stuff, it's not on the internet. It's not. It's not in the books. I've even went through thousands of esoteric books, and they're all different. Because I was convinced that there was one group under the two families worshiping the same God. But I didn't find any documented chains of command or verifiable operational structures. They were different. And maybe that's what Satan means by order out of chaos. He's putting the order into all this crap that we keep, conclusions that we're coming to, and laughing at our faces because that's not even the real truth. Well, that's all I care about. Now, as the narrative moves into the 19th century, it does not disappear. It actually expands. The same narrative, secret societies, who started the French Revolution. Writers like Henry Delassus and George F. Dillon, they begin to interpret the rise of secular governments and modern ideologies as a coordinated spiritual rebellion. And their framework is theological. And their conclusions are rooted in the deep belief that society is being pulled away from God. Yet again, the foundation is interpretation of cultural change, not documentation of a unified hidden system directing those changes from behind the scenes. Now, some of you may say, they got him. They got James. I knew it. He was onto the truth, and they got him. No, not yet. I haven't had the Secret Service knock on my door yet. And when they do, I'll tell you. And then I'll hang up my spurs then. All right, well, that's it. As far as I can go, folks. Because I don't care about hanging up my spurs on this. I don't make any money on this. I'm just doing this because I want to keep a documented account of everything that I built. All of the information that I found on the direction I was going. So that maybe some people in the future can take my work and find what I couldn't. But then a different voice actually enters. Renee Guenon. It's Guenon. Now, Renee does not argue for a centralized conspiracy at all. Instead, he suggests that what appears to be coordinated decline is actually the result of a civilization that has lost its connection to truth and tradition. Now, his work challenges the entire premise, reframing the issue as spiritual disintegration rather than hidden orchestration. Yet even here, the same underlying questions remain. Why does the world feel like it is moving in a unified direction? Well, we're going to continue into economic and social analysis here. Werner Sombart explores how culture and capitalism shape influence. Hilaire Belloc studies the concentration of financial power. And these are not arguments about secret rituals or hidden councils. They are attempts to understand power through observable systems, through money, institutions, and class structures. Even Theodore Herzl writing about the formation of a Jewish state does not so openly publishing his ideas for the world to read, debate, and challenge. But as the timeline reaches the 20th century, something shifts. Earlier ideas begin to merge again. Writers like Nesta Webster pull together religious concern, political upheaval, and historical suspicion into a single, unified explanation of global events. Others like Alfred Rosenberg take those central ideas and harden them into ideology. And at this point, the narrative is no longer a series of interpretations, but it becomes a framework that claims to explain everything at once. And that's what I wanted. And this is where the pattern becomes clear. Across all of these works, the events change, the names change, the enemies change, but the structure of the explanation remains the same. Huh? More importantly, the evidence does not grow with it. There is no continuous documentation of a single governing body across centuries, no consistent leadership trail, no verifiable operational record connecting revolutions, economies, and governments under one unified command. Now, what emerges instead is something more subtle and more powerful. A narrative formed in confusion, expanded during crisis, reinforced through repetition, and inherited without being fully re-examined. And that does not mean there is no power in the world. There is. It's obvious. There are networks. There is influence. There are decisions being made behind closed doors that shape what happens in public view. But if truth is the goal, then a line must be drawn between what is hidden and real and what has been constructed to explain it. Because the most powerful force in history is not always control itself, but the story people believe about control. And before anyone can understand what is happening in the world today, they must first understand the story that they were given to explain it, and whether that story was discovered or built. Now, the modern form of the secret society narrative does not begin in mystery. It begins in crisis. Its roots can be traced to the aftermath of the French Revolution. When Europe experienced a collapse so sudden and so complete that it defied conventional explanation. Monarchies fell, the church lost authority, and long-standing institutions were dismantled in a matter of years. Now, for those living through it, the question was not simply what happened, but how such a transformation could occur with such speed and coordination. It was in that environment of confusion that fear that the first structured explanations of hidden influence began to appear. That's where it says in the books. One of the earliest and most influential voices was Abby Augustin Barruel, whose multi-work volume, Memoirs Illustrating of History of Jacobinism, from 1797 to 1799. Well, that argued that the revolution was not spontaneous, but the result of ideological infiltration carried out through secret societies. Barruel pointed toward Enlightenment philosophers, Alice Bailey, revolutionary clubs, and networks that he believed operated beneath public view. Now, his reasoning was built on the observation that similar ideas appeared across different regions at the same time. And from this, he concluded coordination. However, what he presented was not a documented operational structure, but an interpretation of intellectual influence moving through society. Now, maybe it really does exist, but they could only put the truth out there through interpretation so that they save their necks. And in nearly the same moment, John Robison published Proofs of a Conspiracy. This is in 1797, where he claimed that groups such as Freemasonry and the Bavarian Illuminati had worked to undermine religion and government all across Europe. Robison's argument followed a similar pattern to Barruel's. He identified overlapping membership, shared language, and ideological alignment. But like Barruel, he did not produce a continuous chain of command or verifiable records of centralized direction. His work relied on connecting observable associations and drawing conclusions about intent and coordination. Now, these two works become foundational for secret societies, for they're ruling the world and they're eating babies underneath churches. Not because they proved a hidden system, but because they introduced a framework that could be reused against us. They suggested that when large-scale change appears too coordinated to be accidental, it must be the result of hidden organization. Well, that idea took hold because it offered something people desperately needed in that moment. An explanation that restored a sense of order to chaos. And as the narrative developed, it began to... I learned that the Bible tells us Satan is the author of lies. He's the father of it. That's all he pens on paper. Nothing that comes out of his ass is the truth. So how can he communicate well with mankind if all he does is lie to them? And as the narrative developed, it began to incorporate earlier events and reinterpret them through the same lens. The role of secret societies, political clubs, and intellectual movements became central to explaining not only the French Revolution, but other upheavals as well. Yet when those claims are examined closely, a consistent pattern then emerges. The arguments are built on correlation, timing, and ideological similarity, not on primary documentations of a unified body directing events across religions and across regions. Now, this distinction is critical because it marks the difference between influence and control. The late 18th century was a time of rapid communication of ideas through pamphlets, salons, correspondence, and early political networks. Ideas did spread quickly and groups did share philosophies, but the leap from shared ideology to coordinated global direction was not demonstrated through evidence. It was just simply inferred. Well, it's what had to happen. Well, what began in this period was not a discovery of a hidden order, but the birth of a narrative model, a way of interpreting events that would be carried forward into a 19th and 20th centuries. Once established, this model did not need new proof to survive. It needed only new events to attach itself to. And from that point forward, every major disruption, political, economic, or cultural, would be examined through a lens first shaped in the shadow of revolution. Now, as I continue doing this, I continue finding information, and I continue not finding information. As the narrative moved out of the 18th century and into the 19th, it did not fade, it transformed. What began as a political explanation for a revolution was gradually absorbed into a theological framework. And the question was no longer just how governments fell, but why society itself seemed to be shifting away from its foundations. Now, for many religious thinkers, especially within Catholic Europe, the changes unfolding were not neutral. They were interpreted as a part of a larger coordinated departure from Christian order. Writers like Henry de Lassus took this emerging framework and expanded it significantly. In works such as La Conjuration Anti-Christian and Le Problème de l'Heure Présente, it's a French book, de Lassus argued that modern political movements like liberalism, secularism, socialism, they were not isolated developments but interconnected forces contributing to a broader transformation of society. Now, his reasoning was rooted in an observation of cultural change. And he saw traditional authority weakening, religious influence declining, and new ideologies rising in its place. But from this pattern, he concluded coordination, framing it as a unified movement away from Christian civilization. Similarly, George Dillon, in The War of Antichrist, with the Church and Christian Civilization, a book written in 1885, it presented the conflict in explicitly spiritual terms. Dillon interpreted political and social upheavals as part of a larger battle between the church and opposing forces. And he drew connections between secret societies, revolutionary movements, and ideological shifts, suggesting that these elements were aligned in purpose. Yet again, the structure of the argument followed a familiar pattern. Parallel developments were treated as evidence of coordination, even though direct documentation of unified command remained absent. Look, I didn't want to do this show. Let's be honest. I'm not going to give you information that's bullshit. I want you guys to use discernment and use your hat or your brain instead for a hat collector or a place to hang your hat. That's what I'm doing. And I know it sucks because the more I hold myself accountable to the truth, the more I find out that all the stuff that I thought was real is starting to become fantasy. Because there's no evidence that this shit has been really going on. Now, it could be, them deflecting us, but I don't know. Now, in the 1800s, during that same period, other authors contributed to it. Like the Secret Society book I was just talking about. Figures like J.H.E. Lecontouche and Lecontolu, they explore the role of fraternal organizations, political clubs, and esoteric groups in shaping thought and influencing. Yep, it was all secret societies. And these texts often describe networks of associations, shared symbols, and overlapping memberships. I thought we were getting close here. But while they documented the existence of groups, they did not establish that these groups operated under a single continuous directive spanning nations and generations. And what became clear in this period is that the narrative deepens by shifting from political suspicion to spiritual interpretation. So the concern here is no longer limited to hidden influence in government, but it extends to the transformation of values, belief systems, and moral structures. It's not me. And the idea of a coordinated force begins to take on theological meaning, often framed as a struggle between truth and deception, order and disorder, faith and secularism. And at the same time, the reasoning remains consistent with what emerged in the previous century. Authors observe broad changes occurring across multiple regions, and they identify similarities in ideology and timing, and they interpret these similarities as evidence of coordination. But the leap from shared direction to centralized control continues to rely on inference rather than documented continuity. And this is where the narrative actually gained strength, and I was getting excited about it, not through new forms of evidence, but through expanded scope. By incorporating spiritual language, the explanation becomes more comprehensive. At least we were getting somewhere. And it no longer attempts to explain only revolutions or governments, but the trajectory of civilization itself. And because it speaks to deeper concerns about meaning, morality, and faith, hey, it resonates more strongly with those experiencing rapid change. So it's got to be a spiritual God thing. But by the end of the 19th century, the foundation had been set. The narrative now existed in two forms, political and spiritual, each reinforcing the other. Well, together they created a framework capable of explaining nearly any form of upheaval. And once that framework was established, it did not require new proof to continue. It required only new events to interpret. You see where we're getting at? We're mixing politics with religion, and we're believing in this idea of secret societies ruling the world. Maybe they rule a state. Maybe they rule a country. Maybe they rule two. But the whole world? Half? 75%? As the 19th century moved towards its close, the narrative did not disappear, but it began to encounter resistance, not from denial, but from reinterpretation. You see, a new class of thinkers emerged who did not reject the idea that power existed behind visible structures, but who questioned whether that power required secrecy to operate. Instead of looking for hidden orders, they began examining systems, economic, social, and institutional, as the true drivers of influence. And this shift can be seen in the work of Werner Sombart, particularly in The Jews in Modern Capitalism in 1911. Sombart attempted to explain the development of modern economic systems through cultural and historical analysis. His focus was not on secret meetings or concealed directives, but on observable patterns, trade, finance, mobility, and the role of minority communities within expanding markets. Now, whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, his method marked a departure. He sought explanation through structure, not through hidden orchestration, which is how I view things. Structure. How is it structured? How does it come together? When one person says, kill 10 million, how do they do that? A similar approach actually appeared too in the writings of Hilaire Belloc, especially in the works like The Jews in 1922 and The Servile State, 1912. Belloc examined how economic power could become concentrated within systems, creating dependency and imbalance. His concern was not centered on secret societies controlling events, but on how financial mechanisms, ownership structures, and political alliances shaped outcomes in ways that were visible, even if not widely understood. His analysis pointed toward influence embedded in institutions rather than control exercised from the shadows. And at the same time, political thought began to move in a more open direction. Theodor Herzl in The Jewish State, 1896, represented a very clear example of this shift. Herzl did not write in secrecy. He outlined his ideas plainly, proposing the establishment of a national homeland as a political solution to social conditions in Europe. Well, his work demonstrates that not all movements associated with power or transformation were hidden. Some were articulated openly, debated publicly, and pursued through visible channels. Alongside these developments, philosophical voices continued to challenge the framework of hidden control. René Guénon, in works such as The Crisis of the Modern World and The Reign of the Quantity of the Signs of the Times, argued that the deeper issue was not coordination among secret groups, but a broader civilizational shift away from spiritual principles. In his view, the appearance of a unified decline did not require a centralized planner. It could emerge naturally from a shared departure from tradition and truth. This is where I'm starting to lean towards, folks. You see, we've seen it throughout the Bible when we've been reading and studying it, especially in the Ethiopian to the King James, where every time the Jews said, "Screw you, Lord, we're going to go to Baal for our water." It wasn't because they were worshiping the devil. Well, it was. But they just started to steal, kill, and destroy. And instead of blaming it on a secret society, planning it all, they just did it. It's what the people do, not a certain group. It's what the people do. It could emerge naturally from a shared departure from tradition and truth. And what becomes evident in this period is that the explanation of power begins to divide into two paths. One continues to follow the narrative of hidden coordination, drawing connections between events and suggestions underlying the unity. And the other shifts towards structural analysis, examining how systems themselves, economic, political, and cultural, produce outcomes that can appear coordinated without requiring a single directing force. Now, this divergence is important because it introduces a competing way of understanding the same reality. And believe me, if there are no they, there's many of them, but not one coordinated event, wouldn't just all of those people in all other countries and other ways and other things, wouldn't they all rather you just focus on the Illuminati and focus on the black nobility and not on corruption itself in our own hearts? You see, I'm starting to learn that it's not the secret societies of the problem, it's us. It's our hearts. And this divergence, it's important because it introduces a competing way of understanding the same reality. And when earlier writers saw alignment and concluded conspiracy, these thinkers saw alignment and looked for mechanisms. And they asked how systems function, how incentives operated, how institutions concentrated influence over time. And their answers did not rely on secrecy, but on structure. And yet, even as this alternative framework developed, it did not replace the original narrative. Instead, both interpretations continued side by side. One explaining power hidden through intention, and the other through visible systems, both attempting to answer the same question. But why does the world move in ways that seem coordinated? Well, it's moving in ways that always goes when a nation gives thanks to the devil instead of God. They turn into the secret society baby eaters. You see, there are no secret societies. It's the people. Sure, the Freemasons meet. Sure. Sure, some of them have control over cities. Sure, some of them control even an entire state. But to have all of them coordinated with Scotland and UK and the Vatican and all, that giving them directions and for them to change public opinion, it may have happened, but it was never recorded. And all this stuff we're talking about, in all honesty, it's all old hat. Because the internet, that's a whole new ball game, folks. And the real controllers are controlling ones and zeros. And they're laughing at us because we have to go back to find the power structures, only to realize that it's not even the right people. The narrative takes on its most powerful form through that convergence. And by the early 20th century, something began to change in the way that these ideas were presented. What had once existed as separate lines of thought, political suspicion, theological concern, economic analysis, and philosophical critique, started to merge together. The distinctions between them blurred, and they don't go together. And in their place, a single, more comprehensive narrative began to take shape. It's the Illuminati. It no longer attempted to explain one revolution, one ideology, or one system. It attempted to explain everything at once, and that's the problem. There's no discernment in that. And Robert Curtison said this is the age of discernment. There's no wisdom in that either. And this shift can be seen clearly in the works of Nesta Webster, particularly in World Revolutions, The Plot Against Civilization, 1921, his book. Webster drew heavily from earlier writers such as Barruel and Robison, but expanded their framework significantly. She connected the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and various political movements into a single continuous storyline. Her argument suggested that these events were not isolated, but part of an ongoing, coordinated effort spanning generations. Yet when her sources are examined, it becomes clear that much of her work relies on earlier interpretations rather than newly uncovered primarily documentation. And around the same time, the text known as the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion began to circulate widely, and it presented itself as a record of secret meetings outlining a plan for global control. Well, it'd be great if they put their fucking address at the bottom of it. Headquarters. They didn't. And for many readers, this appeared to prove the missing piece, a document that seemed to confirm what earlier authors had only suggested. However, even in its own time, the text was challenged and later demonstrated to be a fabrication, constructed from earlier political satire and unrelated writings. And despite this, its influence was profound because it gave the existing narrative something it had previously lacked. The appearance of direct evidence. Well, it's not. I thought it was, but it's not. You cannot prove it. And at the same time, industrialists and public figures like Henry Ford contributed to the spread of these ideas through publications such as The International Jew, 1920 to 1922, Ford's work compiled and amplified earlier claims, presenting them to be a much wider audience. And his reasoning combined economic concerns, cultural observations, and inherited narratives into a single explanatory framework. Again, the structure followed the same pattern. Multiple sources brought together to reinforce a unified conclusion without introducing a consistent body of new, verifiable documentation. If you can find this documentation, I'd be happy to read it. Send it my way. In Europe, ideological figures such as Alfred Rosenberg took this consolidation even further. Drawing from a mixture of earlier writings, political theory, and racial ideology, Rosenberg presented a hardened version of the narrative, no longer as a theory to be examined, but as a truth to be asserted. At this stage, the narrative moved out of the realm of interpretation and into the realm of doctrine, where questioning it becomes increasingly difficult. What defines this period is not the discovery of new evidence, but the combination of existing ideas into a single self-reinforcing system. Political upheaval, economic change, religious concern, and social transformation were no longer treated as separate phenomena, which they should be. Merge them, they become blurred. They were unified under one explanation, creating a framework that could be applied to nearly any event. Well, it was the Freemasons. Well, it was the Illuminati. Well, I thought it was too. And this is where the narrative gains its greatest strength. Because when multiple explanations are merged into one, the results feel complete. It feels comprehensive. It feels as though all questions have been answered. But that completeness is not the result of new proof. It's the result of accumulation of ideas layered on top of another until they appear inseparable. And when viewed across time, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Early authors interpret events and suggest hidden influence. Later writers repeat and expand those interpretations. And eventually, those expanded ideas are combined into a single narrative that appears to explain everything. And once that happens, the narrative no longer depends on evidence to sustain itself. It sustains itself through its own internal consistency. And by the time this consolidation is complete, the original distinctions are no longer visible. Now it becomes fact, and it's not. They see one story, continuous, unified, and seemingly confirmed. But that unity is not found in the evidence. It is found in the way the story was built. By the mid-20th century, the narrative had already been constructed. The pieces had been gathered, the arguments combined, the framework solidified. What remained was not a discovery, but distribution. And the story moved beyond the authors who built it and entered the public mind, where it would take on a new life of its own. The transition did not happen through a single event. It happened gradually, as books were republished, translated, summarized, and circulated all across new audiences. Works like those of Nesta Webster and Henry Ford reached readers far beyond their original context, and their ideas were no longer confined to intellectual circles. They became accessible, repeatable, and increasingly detached from the conditions in which they were first written. Well, it was Henry Ford, he wrote it. Could he have done it through just propaganda? Just so he could sell more fucking cars? At the same time, earlier texts continued to resurface. Writings from the 19th century, religious critiques, political analysis, and social commentaries were brought forward and presented alongside newer material. To the average reader, this created the appearance of continuity. It seemed as though multiple generations had independently confirmed the same conclusions. But in reality, many of these works were connected through shared sources, repeated arguments, and inherited frameworks. As communication expanded, so did the reach of the narrative. Pamphlets, radio, later television, and eventually digital media allowed these ideas to spread faster and further than ever before. And the structure of the story made it especially adaptable because it was designed to explain large-scale events. It could be applied to new situations without needing to be rewritten. It gave those bankers a new boogeyman. So each new crisis, economic instability, war, political upheaval, could be interpreted through the same lens. Hey, it's the Illuminati. Yeah, it's the devil worshippers. reinforcing the narrative with every repetition. So over time, something important then shifted. The narrative was no longer encountered as a theory. It was encountered as background knowledge. People did not always remember where they heard it. They simply recognized its shape. A reference to hidden control, a suggestion of coordination, a connection between events. These elements felt familiar even to those who had never read the original works. So this familiarity gave the narrative strength, and it allowed it to move without needing to justify itself. And when an idea becomes widely recognized, it begins to carry authority simply through repetition. It no longer needs to prove its foundation. It only needs to be recognized. And at the same time, the distinction between different types of power became less clear. Real systems of influence, financial institutions, political alliances, international organizations, they were increasingly discussed alongside inherited narratives about hidden control. So because, you go, well, what about the Bohemian Grove? Well, a bunch of naked rich men in the woods having sex with each other. Well, they're worshiping Moloch. So what? That doesn't mean that they're all going to get what they want from one source. They're influencing each other. They all want something from each other. But it doesn't mean that that's where the secret society of all secret societies meet and change the world. Now, both dealt with power operating beyond public visibility, and they were often merged into the minds of readers and listeners. And this blending made the narrative more convincing, but it was more difficult to examine critically. And if you really do some digging on the Bohemian Grove, what I found was they closed that down because there were a bunch of prostitutes, male prostitutes, who were getting beaten up by these billionaires. And so they turned him into the cops, and they had to come up with another story. Well, they're all devil worshippers. Oh, okay. Well, what happened to the story of the male prostitutes that got beat up by the billionaires? So by the time the modern era arrives, the narrative is no longer confined to books. Now everyone's like, secret societies rule the world. It exists in conversation now, in media, cultural memory. And it's referenced without citation, repeated without context, and accepted without being traced back to its origins. And what began as a series of interpretations tied to specific historical moments has now become a generalization explanation for how the world works today. And I don't think it does. And this is where the story reaches its most influential form. Because once a narrative becomes part of the way that people interpret reality, it no longer needs to be introduced. It's already there, shaping perception before the question is even asked. Then you need to hire Alex Jones to come in and expose the whole thing, on the last time that they all meet. Alex Jones, I exposed that. Yeah, I was there. I was at Bohemian Grove. I was the one who exposed him. But that influence comes with a cost, because when a story becomes familiar enough to feel true, it can no longer be evaluated on its own terms. It must be taken apart piece by piece, and that's what I did, and returned to its source, the French Revolution. Only then can it be understood not as a single unified truth, but as a construction built over time. And once that process begins, the question then changes. It is no longer, is the story true? It becomes, how did the story become what it is? And up to this point, the narrative is moved with a certain kind of momentum, folks. It begins in crisis, expands through interpretation, consolidates across authors, and spreads into public thought, gets to Fritz Springmeier, to Santos Bonacci, and to Israel Zeus. But on the surface, it appears to strengthen over time. More books, more voices, more connections, more certainty. But when the material is examined closely, line by line, source by source, that sense of strengthening begins to shift. Because there is a point where the narrative stops building and starts repeating. And this is where the break occurs. It becomes visible when the same foundational claims appear across multiple authors, but without new primary evidence attached to them. Abbey Barul presents an interpretation of revolutionary coordination. John Robinson echoes a similar structure. Decades later, Nesta Webster revisits the same ideas, expanding their scope to include additional events. But when the chain is followed backward, the later conclusions often lead back to the same early sources. So the appearance of multiple confirmations begin to dissolve into a single line of influence. And this pattern repeats in other areas. The introduced of texts like the protocols of the Elders of Zion, or learned Elders of Zion, that gives the impression of direct documentation. Yet when its origins are examined, it does not connect to a verifiable network of meetings or leadership. Instead, it draws from earlier writings and constructed material. Well, despite this, it's cited alongside historical works as if it completes them, reinforcing the narrative without adding independent confirmation. Look, we can't fight the devil with lies. Sorry. I could have a huge show and so many followers if I just lied about all this shit. Just say, yep, I saw him. I was in a tunnel. And they had a bunch of people wearing horns, and they were worshiping the devil, and they were eating babies. And then I could tell you, I could record it because, I didn't have cell service in the cave. It's stupid shit like that. Bring it out, no proof. And at that stage, something subtle would critically happen, don't you think? Because the burden of proof will shift. Instead of each claim requiring its own evidence, the narrative begins to rely on its accumulated presence. One book references another. The author supports a previous conclusion. And over time, the repetition itself becomes an argument. So the reader is no longer evaluating individual claims. They're absorbing a unified story that appears to have been confirmed across generations, and it hasn't. And I'm disappointed, just like you. But when that story is separated back into its parts, the continuity begins to weaken. So there's no consistent documentation of a single governing body moving through history. No verified chain of leadership connecting centuries. Dynasties, yes. Secret societies and one controller, one group, one worshiping one devil, no. No verified chain of leadership connecting for centuries. No operational records that demonstrate coordinated control across revolutions, economies, and nations. What exists are interpretations of events, often shaped by the conditions in which they were written. Remember, we can no longer prove the Albert Pike letter to Giuseppe, what's his name, that explains that World War I, World War II, and then the coming World War III against the Christians and the Muslims, because it's gone. And people by memory saying, I remember it. Oh, I thought I saw it by memory, but I don't have proof that it exists. So that's the point where the narrative breaks. Now, it could have been taken on purpose. I get it. But without verifiable proof, I can't tell you that it's a fact. Not because that it disappears, the narrative, but because its structure then changes. It's no longer supported by expanding evidence, because there is none. It's sustained by internal consistency. It's the same framework that's being applied again and again and again, producing similar conclusions regardless of the event being examined over hundreds of years. And that consistency can feel convincing, because a story that explains everything does not need to adjust. It absorbs new information and reshapes it to fit the existing pattern. Every crisis becomes confirmation. Every shift becomes validation. Every new development is interpreted through the same lens. But that's not how evidence behaves. Evidence sharpens. It clarifies. It introduces new detail. It reduces uncertainty over time. And repetition does something different. It stabilizes a narrative without strengthening its foundation. And once that distinction is seen, it cannot be unseen. Because the question is no longer whether the narrative exists. It clearly does. The question is whether it has been proven or simply preserved. And at this point, a line has to be drawn, don't you think? At least for me. Not to dismiss everything that's been discussed. It's a possibility that it's been wiped clean. but to separate two things that have been blended together for generations: real power and the narrative built to explain it. And one of the reasons this story has endured for so long is because it does not begin with fiction. It begins with something that is undeniably true. There is power in this world that is not fully visible. There are decisions being made behind closed doors: financial influence, entire economies, and political alliances. They all are formed in private. Yes! There are strategies developed outside of public view and networks of individuals who hold influence across nations. Yes! They're not theories, but they are documented realities, confirmed by history and observable in the structures that shape global events. But the narrative does something more than acknowledge that reality. It extends it. It moves from influence to total control, from networks to a single unified system, from coordination in specific areas to orchestration across all areas. And in doing so, it creates a framework that feels complete because it begins with something that is real and builds outward from it. Well, it's got to be Orsini and the Lee family. There's evidence that leads to the Orsinis, yes. The Lee family, just a little bit. This is where the distinction becomes critical, because writers like Werner Sombart and Hilaire Belloc examined how power concentrates within systems through finance, ownership, and institutional structure. Their work points to mechanisms that can be studied and understood. These are forms of influence that operate in the open, even if their full implications are not always recognized. And they do not require secrecy to function, only structure. And at the same time, thinkers like René Guénon approach the issue from a different direction, suggesting that what appears to be coordinated movements may actually be the result of a shared departure from foundational truth. In this view, alignment does not require a central authority directing every outcome. It can emerge from a common shift in values, beliefs, and priorities across societies. The inherited narrative begins taking these observations and merges them into something more broader. And it assumes that because influence exists, there must be a single source directing it. Because coordination appears, there must be a unified command behind it. Because systems produce consistent outcomes, there must be intention guiding every part of the process. But that step from influence to total orchestration is not demonstrated through documentation. It's constructed through interpretation. And once that interpretation is accepted, everything begins to fit within it. Then comes your Santo Bonaccis and your Israel Zeus and your Fritz Springmeyers. Financial systems become tools of control, political alliances become evidence of coordination, and cultural shifts become proof of intention. Thus, the narrative becomes self-reinforcing, not because it is continually proven, but because it is designed to explain every outcome in advance. Because if you tell a lie long enough, it becomes the truth. It does not need to adjust because it already contains an answer for everything that it encounters. So separating these two realities changes the way everything is seen, folks. It allows power to be examined without assumption. It allows systems to be studied without being absorbed into a single explanation. It allows influence to be understood in its actual form, complex, layered, and often decentralized, rather than reduced to one hidden source. Now, this does not weaken understanding. It should sharpen your understanding of discernment. Because once the inherited narrative is set aside, what remains can be evaluated on its own terms. Decisions can be traced, institutions can be analyzed, and networks can be mapped without forcing them into a predetermined conclusion. Well, it's the Ashkenazis. It's Netanyahu and the Ashkenazis. They're controlling the entire world. Well, it's the Rothschild family. Well, it's the Orsini. Well, many come and say, no, the Medici have way more power than any other family in Europe. So that's where clarity should begin. Not in denying the power exists, but in refusing to explain that all power is within one story. Because the moment everything is explained by the same narrative, nothing is truly being examined here, folks. I'm not doing my job. I'm not being a good pastor. Pastors don't tell rumors. Pastors don't tell you of something they heard through the grapevine. Not denying that power exists, but refusing to explain all power to one story, because the moment everything is explained by the same narrative, nothing is truly being examined. And maybe this is why they shut you down on TikTok for saying Illuminati, Black nobility, Orsini, Rothschild. Because when they shut you down, you think, oh my God, I'm onto something. But you're not. They just want you to think that. They want you to follow Pepe Orsini everywhere he goes. So by the time the narrative reached the 20th century, its structure was already established. And what followed was not the discovery of new foundational evidence, but the continued transmission of existing claims through publication, translation, and republication. I'm sorry, but all that was given to me is proof that this process can be traced directly through the works themselves. And that's funny. It's like someone's like, here's your proof all six secret societies exist. Well, no, this actually proves that this has been a narrative that has been dragged along and called proof and fact, which it really isn't. Because texts such as those by Nesta Webster, including World Revolution or The Plot Against the Civilization, 1921, it explicitly drew from earlier authors like Abby Augustine or Barul or John Robison. So in her citations and arguments, earlier interpretations are not replaced with new primary documentation, but expanded and applied to later events such as the Russian Revolution. So this creates a direct line of textual inheritance where the same foundational claims are extended across new historical contexts. Meaning, they're basing off of interpretation and not facts. I found a similar pattern that appeared in widely circulated compilations such as The International Jew by Henry Ford. This work aggregates earlier claims, quotations, and interpretations into a consolidated format rather than introducing new verifiable records of coordination. It actually presents a synthesis of existing material, allowing previously separate arguments to appear as a unified body of evidence. Hey, if Ford printed it. So the role of specific documents also becomes significant in this period, and the text known as the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion is repeatedly cited alongside historical works as if it proves some direct confirmation of earlier theories. It doesn't. Independent investigations in the early 20th century demonstrated that this documentation was constructed from earlier sources. They even called it Nazi propaganda. And they also found it from political satire. But despite this, it continued to be reproduced and referenced, reinforcing the narrative without adding new primary verification. So they still can't prove it. So why are we talking about it? I'm guilty. I did it too, but I'm trying to be a better person. So the persistence of the narrative can also be observed through reprinting and translation. 19th century works such as Barul's memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism and Robison's proof of a conspiracy were republished and circulated well into the 20th century, and they had no proof. And their availability in new editions allowed later authors to continue drawing from them, maintaining continuity of argument without requiring new foundational evidence. They were speculating, folks. Sorry. Go look it up yourself. That's what I found. I've got all the books. I'll give them to you. Take all the books, shove them into AI, and learn for yourself. There's no evidence. And in addition, thematic overlap across different authors contributes to the appearance of independent confirmation, and it's not. Writers addressing political revolution, economic change, or religious decline often reference similar events and ideas. However, when these references are traced, they frequently lead back to a limited set of earlier works. So this creates a network of cross-referencing texts that appear diverse, but are connected through shared sources. So this pattern of initial interpretation followed by repetition, followed by consolidation, can be observed directly within the corpus itself. It does not rely on assumption. It can be followed through citations, publication timelines, and textual comparison. And this is why you don't see this shit in college works. Because there's no evidence. So by examining the material, the persistence of the narrative becomes traceable, and it's carried forward through identifiable channels. Authors reference earlier works. Text can be published across generations and compilations, presenting inherited claims as unified evidence. But is there? No. Because just because you want it to be true doesn't mean it is. Sorry. It's not me. I'm doing the Holy Ghost's work here. He wants me not to give you a bunch of stuff that isn't true. He wants me to bring you on the right path. Not saying that these secret societies don't meet and kill babies. Well, when it comes to the learned elders of Zion, a group of Jews controlling the world, sorry. They don't control the whole world. And there's evidence through the data. They don't control Russia. Not China. So evaluation of the narrative here requires a consistent method that can be applied across all texts, regardless of author, language, or time period. And this method begins with identifying the type of claim being made and the form of evidence used to support it. Primary evidence and sources are distinguished from secondary interpretations. And a primary source consists of direct records such as letters, meeting minutes, official documents, or firsthand testimony that can be independently verified. Secondary sources consist of analysis, commentary, and interpretation built upon earlier material. In works such as Memoirs Illustrating the History of Jacobinism by Abby Augustin Barruel and Proofs of a Conspiracy by John Robinson, the arguments rely primarily on interpretation of events and associations rather than verifiable records of centralized coordination. They didn't find a handbook. They didn't find a letter. So the next step is source tracing. Citations within a text are followed backwards to determine their origin. And when later works such as World Revolution, The Plot Against Civilization by Nesta Webster references earlier authors, these authors and references are compared directly to the original texts. And this allows identification of whether new evidence can be introduced to whether earlier claims are being restated. So cross-referencing, this is then applied across multiple works. And if separate authors present similar claims, then their sources are compared to determine whether the agreement is independent or derived from shared references. And when multiple texts cite the same earlier works, the appearance of independent confirmation is reduced to a single line of influence. So document verification should follow. Claims that reference specific documents are checked against known historical records. And in the case of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, comparisons with earlier published material demonstrate that sections of the text were adopted from unrelated sources. So this establishes the origin of the document and its relation to prior writings. So chronological alignment is also required here. Claims of long-term coordination are tested by examining whether a continuous chain of individuals, organizations, or directives can be documented across time. So this includes identifying consistent leadership, preserved communication, or operational continuity, where such continuity is not present in the historical record. So the claim remains unverified. Thus, distinction between correlation and causation is applied throughout the evaluation. So the presence of similar ideas, overlapping memberships, or concurrent events is recorded as correlation. Establishing causation requires direct evidence linking those elements through documented action and instruction. Without evidence, conclusions remain interpretive. So translation and republication. Analysis is also conducted, and text appears in multiple languages or editions are compared to determine whether content has been altered, condensed, or recontextualized. So this step identifies how ideas are transmitted and whether meaning changes across versions. And finally, aggregation is examined. Works that compile material from multiple sources, such as The International Jew by Henry Ford, are analyzed to determine whether they introduce new primary evidence or reorganizing existing claims. Remember, he supported the Nazis, not the Jews. Watchman says, James, I'm so glad you're back. Your guest host bullied me, said I was a fried shrimp. I said, speak for yourself, bucko. Any and all comments about my backup sources can be emailed to me@jamescarter.com. Thank you very much. I'm sorry you two got into an altercation. Now applying, hey, I don't know if it's you or him. I'm not putting point and blame at all. I just think what you just said was quite funny. Now I lost my train of thought. So applying this method produces a consistent framework here for evaluation, don't you think? Boots, to the rescue, calm down. I didn't think that Josh Urban would start calling people fried shrimp. So across collected material here, folks, the earliest structured claims of coordinated hidden influence appear in the late 18th century, primarily in memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism by Abbe Barulio and Proofs of a Conspiracy by John Robinson. So these works attribute the events surrounding the French Revolution to ideological networks and secret societies, and their arguments are based on interpretation of political developments, shared ideas, and associations between groups. Then in the 19th century, additional works expanded these interpretations into religious and social contexts. Sorry, that's what it is. Texts by authors such as Henry DeLassus and George Dillon connect political and cultural changes to broader theological frameworks, and these works reference earlier authors and apply similar explanatory structures to new developments without introducing a continuous set of primary documents demonstrating centralized coordination across regions. And by the early 20th century, later authors incorporate earlier material into consolidated narratives, like in The World Revolution, The Plot Against Civilization. Nesta Webster references prior works, including those of Barul and Robinson, and applies their frameworks to additional historical events, such as the Russian Revolution. So this establishes a traceable line of textual dependence. Compilations of The International Jew by Henry Ford. These compilations present published claims, creating a unified structure of argument without introducing any independently verifiable primary records or sources. And the document protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion's 20th century identified that portions of this document were derived from earlier publications. So no continuous set of primary documents was identified within the examined material that demonstrates a single governing body operating across multiple centuries of consistent leadership, documented communications, and verifiable operations, control over political, economic, and social events. So, to conclude, the material reviewed spans multiple centuries, authors, languages, and ideological positions. The examination followed a consistent method, identifying claims, tracing citations, comparing texts across time, and distinguishing between primary documentation and secondary interpretation. This process allows the structure of the narrative to be observed directly within the documents itself. Ford was quoting non-factual material, just opinion. And they expanded that framework over and over and over again. By the 20th century, they consolidated into Nesta Webster, Imperial and Robinson, and other prior writers to lead to events such as the Russian Revolution. That established a true traceable line of textual inheritance in which later works rely on earlier interpretations. Sorry, it's not true. And there's no continuous set of primary documents that have been identified within the examined material demonstrating a single governing body operating across multiple centuries with consistent leadership, preserved communication, and verifiable operational control over political, economic, and social systems. Sorry, it's not there. The material does contain documented examples of organizations, institutions, financial systems, and political movements. Yes. What's up, Edged? Their integration into a single explanatory framework occurs through interpretation within the texts. The progression observed in the record follows a consistent sequence, too. Initial interpretations are formed in response to specific historical events. And these interpretations are repeated and expanded by later authors. So over time, multiple lines of interpretations are consolidated into unified narratives that present diverse developments as components of a single system. Well, this sequence can be followed directly through citations, textual comparison, and publication history. You see, facts should not be scared of the truth. The findings presented are derived from the documents, their references, and their transmissions over time, meaning I went through their sources, and their sources are bonk. That's how it goes. This has been Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Tune in tomorrow night when I'm live with Urban. We're going to be talking about the sources of the dynasties and the information. We're going to be talking about Israel Zeus. We're going to expose him. We're going to talk about Santos Bonacci, Fritz Springmeier, and the like. But anyway, thank you guys so much. God bless you, God thank you, and God keep you. We will see you guys mañana.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.